Hey, welcome to the show. Eric Peters joins me. And Eric, all I can say is it's a good thing because there is so much going on here. We're going to talk today about a number of instances in which the narrative, the official narrative, is falling apart like a soup sandwich. And I don't even know where to begin because there are so many places this is happening. Any place particular you would like to start?
Well, one we might pick up on, you and I talked for a little while off the air about this movie, The Apprentice, that I stumbled on that came out, I guess, about 2 years ago. And I thought it was a very interesting movie for a number of reasons. And one of them was something that I had totally forgotten about, which is that when Trump was a young man in the early 70s, another man took him under his wing. And essentially, Trump was the apprentice of this man. And that man was Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn was the archetypical fixer. He was a villain of almost unimaginable magnitude. He was an aide to Joe McCarthy back in the 50s. He then became a good friend of Richard Nixon's. And he's just this totally nihilistic, amoral shyster lawyer who would not be restrained by any considerations of right or wrong. And he gave Trump three rules. And the rules were to always attack, attack, attack. Number one, by any means necessary. And the second was to deny and admit to deny everything and admit nothing. And then finally, even when they've got you dead to rights, refuse to concede that you're wrong or defeated. Does it sound familiar?
Very much so, but not just for Trump. I mean, I see a lot of politicians operating like that, but how curious that you know, I I've heard of Roy Cohn. I had not made the connection to he and Trump
Nor
before.
had I. Again, it was a piece of forgotten history for me, which I was kind of ashamed of. I ought to know these things, but it's particularly interesting to me because, a large portion of Trump's following consists of nominally Christian people, and they seem to not have any problem with this man being completely amoral, unwilling to ever acknowledge that he's wrong about anything. In fact, to just literally fart in our faces, forgive the language. A good example of this, a couple of days ago, he publicly lauded Albert Bourla, the head of Pfizer, this criminal, this guy, who profiteered off the misery of 320 million Americans, doubled down on all the vaccine stuff, and awarded yet another sweetheart federal deal to Pfizer to milk Americans dry for the sake of this criminal scumbag. And how can people of any good faith look at that and not be appalled?
Okay, let me push back a little bit though, and I want to get your reaction on this. Um, what you're saying rings true, and I think anybody with who can still be objective. I know there's some people who can't help but put Trump above, their ideological or their political loyalty. But um, what about all the effort that was undertaken by the deep state, the spying, the Russiagate, the arrests, the indictments, and so forth? I feel pretty safe in saying the deep state, or at least the Washington swamp, threw an awful lot of garbage at Trump trying to take him down. Um, I have a hard time believing that was all for show. I think that was a legitimate effort to destroy him and to marginalize his supporters. Having said that, you know, I see him doing things that I find extremely disagreeable. At the same time, um, I feel a bit of sympathy for the guy just because of what has been thrown at him. Maybe I'm just being manipulated.
Well, yeah, I did too. And I think that's part of the art of the con, if you will, to generate sympathy and resentment and anger. I think one of the reasons Trump was elected in the landslide was because of the outrage of everything that occurred during the prior 4 years, including specifically the use of the power of the federal government to suppress people's speech, to marginalize people, to pariahize people, which is why it is so infuriating to now find that this man who was elected to supposedly prevent that from ever happening again is doing exactly that. He is going after people like Jimmy Kimmel, who he personally doesn't like. Again, I'm not carrying water for Jimmy Kimmel. I'm just pointing out the man's an entertainer. He's got a show. It's not the business of the federal government to decide what we're allowed to watch, just like it's not the business of the federal government to decide what we're allowed to see on X or social media back during the pandemic. He's pushing this real ID stuff. He's cozying up to these tech bros who are trying to impose a Palantir-based surveillance system on us. He is essentially saying that if you criticize whatever the government of Israel does, you're anti-Semitic. You can't even in some places it is a near crime now to quote unquote boycott the state of Israel, to not wish to do business with them because you're appalled by what the government of Israel is doing to people in Gaza. Think about that. The federal government is saying you can't express dissent peacefully by saying, you know what, I'm uncomfortable with what this government is doing. And so I'm not going to do business with that government. Remember when that was a tool used to deal with the South African apartheid system? South Africa was made a pariah
Right.
state via boycotts. Companies and people just said, you know what, I'm not doing business with South Africa because I'm extremely uncomfortable with what they're doing. And that was considered totally legitimate. And it was. And there's nothing illegitimate about saying, you know what, I don't want to do business with Israeli companies or have my money go to Israel because of this stuff that they're doing over there. Trump wants to make that, effectively a crime. And it's really worrisome. And I have real difficulty understanding how, again, a huge cohort of his support base are Christians, how they can stomach that and just overlook it and go along with it.
Well, and I'll give you another example of where, again, personal or political loyalty seems to trump principles, pun intended. I was mentioning to a friend as we were out hiking yesterday. I was like, I'm not comfortable with this extrajudicial killing, blowing up these vessels allegedly from Venezuela, allegedly smuggling fentanyl. We don't know that. All we know is there's a boat out there on the ocean, and the U.S. Navy has blown it up, and we're being told that we're safer. But there was no due process in the sense that it was not proven who was aboard that boat, what they had, that their intent was to smuggle drugs. We just are supposed to take the president's word, kind of like back in the Obama administration, that they're bad, and therefore on the president's word, we can blow them up. And the response that my friend gave me, and this kind of shook me a little bit, was he goes, well, but they've been doing that for years. And it's like, that doesn't make
He's
it
right.
okay, though.
Doesn't make it okay, but he's right. And bad ideas, unfortunately, are kind of like cancer, in that if you don't do something about it, it's going to kill you eventually. And I trace this back many, many decades. I often write articles about things like the so-called drunk driving checkpoints, which are based on the same idea. These sort of dragnet ideas. The federal government, the state government, they assert that we have to deal with whatever it is. Pick your category: drunk drivers, terrorists, narco traffickers, and essentially you're guilty until proved innocent, and you're subjected to treatment as if you had done the thing. And this has been going on for decades, and Americans have gotten used to it. The whole idea of probable cause that used to be a bedrock principle of this country, i.e., you have to establish that somebody is probably doing something bad and illegal before you begin to go after them. So
Yes.
getting back to this Venezuela thing, leaving aside that it's extraterritorial. I mean, we're not even talking about within the United States, but setting that aside, what you said is exactly right. We don't know who these people are. It could have been a random yacht out there. We don't know is the point. And there's something really troubling about just blowing people up on the basis of say so and implication that they might be up to something. Because, as much as some people might want to cheer that, if that doctrine is accepted, watch out, because it can end up turning around and being applied to you too.
And that was actually how I responded to my friend. I was like, but when Trump isn't in office, and when it is a Democrat next time, what's to stop that same kind of reasoning from being used against, us? Anybody who's not in lockstep, anybody who's not chanting with the same
Absolutely.
enthusiasm as the members of the party. I mean, we're in a very dangerous place. And and as much as I want to believe, Trump is the one that's going to save us, it should be pretty clear. He's not Kamala and company, and thank goodness for that. But we're not out of danger, not by a long shot.
I don't know that he's better than Kamala. I've really come down the road quite a way, because I think if we had Kamala and Kamala were pursuing the same authoritarian actions that Trump is, the people who support Trump or who are nominally conservative, certainly Christians, would be up in arms about it. Right now we've got the people who are supporting Trump being kind of insouciantly indifferent to the fact that we're being slow marched into martial law. The president is on the verge of declaring the Insurrection Act, and effectively that's martial law. Effectively, he can declare you, me, anybody he wants to. Oh, it's just those bad people, that the anti-ICE protesters, the Antifa people. But the principle matters. Once that happens,
Yep.
it metastasizes. And Trump is exactly the kind of personality to do that, because he is somebody who has the attitude that if you don't support him absolutely in every way, then effectively you're some kind of a traitor. Even if it's well meant, you raise your hand and say, well, Mr. President, I disagree with this, and here's why. You're with the enemy. I mean, he's even worse in this respect than George Bush was. And that That's quite something.
That was bad. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned these ICE protests and some of the escalating well, I'll just call it what it is. It's violence that's escalating in these cities, Chicago and Portland and so forth. It seems like there's testing being done there on the part of Antifa and the people who are, I believe they're paid protesters out there, pushing back against ICE. And federal troops coming. Somebody jokingly pointed out, "Oh, look, northern states for the first time are realizing, hey, they're sending federal troops in to enforce something that the
Yeah,
president wants." And it's like, yeah,
yeah,
the Southerners had a few thoughts on that a few years back.
absolutely. It didn't turn out too well for them, did it?
Not at
The
all.
latest thing, I can't remember the person's name, but the mayor of Chicago, whoever that is now, has declared
Brandon
the
Johnson.
city, yeah, has declared the city a safe zone, or what do you call it, a sanctuary city from
Hmm.
ICE. And, then Trump's going to kick that up because he'll view that as a challenge. And so he'll send in his federal shock troops. And at what point does the shooting begin between these state level authorities and federal authorities? And then he declares an insurrection. And then we have martial law. And then what? This escalating trend towards an authoritarian system is deeply troubling.
As you and I were getting ready to go on the air, I asked, "How are you doing?" And you kind of jokingly says, "Well, just waiting for World War III." And I laugh nervously, but I got to tell you, Eric, that is one of the things that's really on my mind right now. Not that I have any influence to stop what's happening geopolitically, but it sure feels like we are being slow marched into a direct conflict. And I think the goal all along has been some kind of kinetic war with Russia, and NATO will probably be the first to get us going. But I don't see how the U.S. doesn't get pulled into it, full bore.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You and I grew up in the Cold War. We remember the Soviet Union, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I never really worried too much about the Soviet Union nuking us because my thought was that the Soviet Union was run by basically sane people, and they weren't interested in mutual annihilation any more than we were. And so it was just sort of the stalemate. Well, now we're at a point where I think maniacs are in charge and are willing to go down that road if need be, if they think it's going to serve their interests, not just in Ukraine. What's going on in the Middle East right now is extraordinarily worrying. Apparently, Trump has decreed that Qatar in the Middle East is now under the defensive umbrella of the United States. And why would that be? Well, because there's an air base in Qatar that we're using to station tankers, now KC-130 tankers that could be very conveniently situated to refuel our planes as they go to bomb Iraq. And Netanyahu is now implying that the Iranians once again are, just short of having nuclear weapons, and they're gonna detonate a nuclear weapon in the United States, which is absurd. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Israelis, frankly, detonated a nuclear bomb in the United States because they're losing the narrative war. People are cluing into that state being out of control, and if they feel like they're losing a grip on that narrative, they might just do something like that, and boom, and then it's game over for all of us.
And I know this is skating onto the thin ice. I hear it cracking around me even as I say this. But the news that came out about um, Israeli aligned financiers and others buying influencers, and paying
$7,000 a
American
pop, right?
influencers. Yeah, I mean it's $7,000 a pop for a post on social media.
Yeah.
And I mean, on the one hand, it's like great, you've got people to carry your water, and I kind of feel bad for the people who took the bait and were willing to essentially sell their soul in a buyer's market.
Yeah, and I wonder who paid for that. It was probably us. Ultimately, we pay taxes. The taxes end up going into foreign aid. Huge chunk of that goes to Israel, and so we get to pay for these influencers to peddle their nonsense about what's going on over there, and we can't have an honest conversation. And I think people are tired of that. I think people are. I'm personally very, very tired of being accused of being anti-Semitic for questioning anything that Netanyahu or the state of Israel does as distinct, implying that somehow I hate Jewish people because I hate what Netanyahu is doing. That is such a greasy, vile tactic to deploy. We had to deal with that for decades with the race thing, and then the tranny thing. It's all of a piece of trying to to slander people and question their morals so as to not have to deal with the legitimate questions that they're trying to raise.
That was well said. And I know it's enough to keep a lot of people completely silent. If only out of fear of, well, I just don't know what I can say without, being at risk of being labeled an anti-Semite or a bigot or whatever. And we've got to be to the point where um, what people call us doesn't matter. In other words, our commitment to truth is stronger than our commitment to comfort.
Yeah. Yeah, and I frankly think that not only is that charge losing its power, it is causing people to realize that the truth of what their questions are really valid. If they weren't, it would be easy to dismiss them. If they're not true, okay, here are the facts that prove that they're not true. Why would you have to resort to this hysterical campaign of calling people anti-Semites? Well, you have to do that because you're scared that what they're saying is solid and you don't want to deal with it. So you just shriek ever louder, "Oh, Holocaust, you want to exterminate us, blah blah." It's insufferable. And I think we're at the point of a kind of inflection where, and I think this is why it's so worrisome. I think Netanyahu and his rabid Zionist people, the Likudniks and the neocons in this country, who are indistinguishable, they're all part of the same group, recognize that they're losing the control that they had, that people aren't afraid anymore, and they're wanting to talk about it. They're wanting to talk about Charlie Kirk and some of these, things that were going on behind the scenes. They're beginning to talk about 9/11. Tucker Carlson's new revisiting of the whole 9/11 thing, which by the way, Kirk was going to actively promote and bring to the attention of all these young kids, who weren't even alive at the time of 9/11. It strongly stinks. There's smoke and there's fire behind that smoke.
No, I hear you. And this the goal here. We're not here to simply tear down Trump or take away people's hope, but just understand that we get played a lot, and no one is coming to save us. If you're going to improve your position, that's something you're going to have to take responsibility for. And can you get it perfect? Probably not. We're all feeling the pinch of trying to keep our gas tanks full, the roof over our head, property taxes paid, and so forth. But anything you can do to to better your position, to be self-reliant, to not have to depend on government to help you, is going to pay off in the long run because you have the
Absolutely.
ability to say no.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know whether you have seen this. There's an interesting new streaming show that takes three families and puts them back basically in the 1880s. Have you seen it?
I
So they have to
haven't.
give up their devices and
Oh,
modern life basically, and they have to try to live according to how things were back then. And it's entertaining to watch, but at the same time, it's also educational in that it's like, wow, remembering and recovering the skill sets that we used to have is important, in so many ways, because if things do get really ugly, those skill sets are not going to be just, oh, let's go out for the weekend and be primitive. This is going to be potentially the thing that keeps you and your family alive versus not.
yep. And I think a big part of people keeping their sanity these days is going to come from learning when to turn off the media, turn off the Washington, D.C. soap opera, and focus on things that are actually worthwhile. Are you teaching your kids how to take care of chickens, how to tend to a garden, how to hunt, how to fish, how to do first aid? These are simple things, but they would sure pay off handily if at some point you find yourself, having to stand on your own 2 feet.
Sure. And just being outside, all those things that you mentioned, being away from a screen, it's nothing shy of tragic what's happened to the rising generation of kids who grow up immersed in the screen. That's all that you see them, their faces in the screen all the time.
Yep.
Not like us when we were kids, as soon as you got home from school, you rushed out the door to go play with your friends and be outside, ride your bikes, play pickup sports, whatever. These kids, they come home and immediately they get on the game station or, their cell phones or whatever. And that's bad. And the social media thing, now that the evidence of the psychological and emotional damage that does to young people in particular is absolutely overwhelming. So if you have kids in that age group, figure out a way to get them out of the screen and outside in the real world.
This isn't a flex, but you and I, members of Generation X, we enjoyed an awful lot of freedom. It took a lot for our parents to clip our wings. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he was saying, "Oh yeah, we would ride our bikes all over town." And then he was telling me the only time he really got in trouble was at about age 12. He and his buddies thought we're going to ride out to this natural hot springs, which was like 14 miles outside of
Mhm.
town, but they didn't tell their parents where they were going first. And he's like, "Yeah, there was a little reckoning after that." But the point is, really, we had a lot of freedom. And today it seems like parents are encouraged to clip the kids' wings preemptively to make sure they're not in trouble, and then stick them in front of a screen to keep them occupied and, presumably safely indoors.
Well, sure. Freedom has been criminalized, though. I'm going to come to the defense of the parents. They're in an impossible position. There was a case, I'm sure are familiar with it, where a woman was at home with her kid and she let her kid play in the backyard. And she was busy doing something in the house. And some nosy neighbor decided to call the cops because this kid was in their own net backyard playing, unsupervised by the parent, apparently. And the cops came and the Child Protective Services people came and they charged the mother with some kind of crime and they like put them in the system because of that. Like you said, it was common back in the day for kids 10, 12 years old to go out ride their bikes all afternoon, miles away from home, and that wasn't a crime. People just did that. Parents, encouraged it. And so as a result, we developed that sense of autonomy and freedom far sooner than today's kids who are really cloistered. You hear the term helicopter parent. Well, there's also the
Yep.
helicopter government. Kids have to be strapped into the child safety seat. They're not allowed to do anything essentially on their own. It's just constant supervision. It's got to be so oppressive to be a kid today. I can't even imagine what it's like.
Well, I know I like to leave listeners with solutions, and I'm
Mhm.
going to just echo what Andy Frisella says on his podcast, and that is the ultimate act of rebellion is to become a truly excellent individual, and I mean in every possible way. Physically, you're taking care of yourself. Mentally and spiritually taking care of yourself. Financially, you're as independent as you can be, self-sufficient. That's how it's done. And when you do that, you inspire the people around you to do likewise. And I think, especially for people of our generation, we have a responsibility to the especially Gen Z and the upcoming generations to show them that that's the way to go, as opposed to sit on the curb and cry harder for Big
I
Daddy to
agree.
come
And
and
I
save you.
think one of the most powerful things that Charlie Kirk demonstrated was thoughtfulness and consideration toward people that he disagreed with. He would entertain questions from these sometimes very agitated and loudmouthed people, and he would calmly try to have a conversation with them. And that was really effective. As a culture, we become so ideological. You encounter somebody that has a different point of view, and the voices raise, and you shout at each other. There's not a conversation of, well, let me hear why you think that way. And here's my point of view in reply. And let's see where we differ and why. That's something that we have got to recover too. If we want to have a civil society, you can't have a civil society where everything's ideological and you base your friendships and everything else on who is in lockstep with you ideologically.
Amen. I think this is probably a great jumping off point right here. Eric, thanks as always for sharing your thoughts on the passing scene.
You bet,
Who
Bryan.
know who knows what the next week will bring, but I'm sure we'll have
Yep,
some fun stuff to talk about.
I bet we will.
Thanks again.
You bet.